So we saw last time that the Cold War comes down to fear, especially heightened during that 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis, a tangible fear that nuclear holocaust can happen at any time. And that fear did so much. Fear is a force in the world that can lead people to do things they ought not to do. FDR may not have been entirely right that fear itself is the only thing we have to fear, but he was onto something. It's certainly high on the list. While the Cold War went on and on and on, the US slowly but steadily outpaced the Russians. But of course, it didn't just end up being about the Russians. The enemy was communism, it was any extension of the Soviet sphere of influence. And we saw that the Korean War was a hotspot, an eruption of combat around the threat of communism's spread. Vietnam was similarly motivated. In what's called the First Indochina War, France had been fighting the communists, the nationalists, and anti imperialists in the French colony of Indochina with US funding. But the Indochinese were fighting against occupation. The French couldn't win. They left in 1954, at which point Indochina is divided into 4 countries: North Vietnam, South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, as per the 1954 Geneva Accords. The North Vietnamese Viet Minh were communists. The Viet Cong in the South were an insurgent group supported by the Viet Minh. There was communism in the former French colony, and the U.S. fights communism, and the French were leaving, so the U.S. decides to try its hand. November 1st, 1955 is the official beginning of America's involvement in Vietnam. It's the VA's own qualifying date for getting the name of a military service member killed onto the Vietnam War Memorial in D.C. Now, Truman had sent the first advisors into Vietnam in 1950, but at that point they were aiding the French, who were primarily in control, and it wasn't until the French sort of had to leave, as per the Geneva Accords in 1956, that Americans started to take a lead role in this advisory position. So 1955, when they began doing that, is the official beginning of the U.S. involvement. At that point, there are U.S. advisors. They're there in a supportive role, supporting, advising, but never more than 1,000 of them. Things progress slowly but steadily, and mostly relatively uneventfully. The Military Assistance Advisory Group, which was the name of the group of military advisors, who were the start of the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, they were occasionally attacked by communist guerrilla groups, but mostly it was slowly upscaled status quo until the first week of August 1964. On August 2nd, 1964, the USS Maddox fires 3 warning shots at two North Vietnamese torpedo boats in the Tonkin Gulf. Those boats fired back. The U.S. engaged. The U.S. won. At the time, and until the former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara's 2003 documentary memoirs and the 2005 release of the Pentagon Papers, the U.S. claimed that the North Vietnamese fired first. They did not. There was no Defense Department response at the time to the events of August 2nd, but then 2 days later, on August 4th, 1964, 2 U.S. ships believed that they were under attack by, again, North Vietnamese torpedo boats. They gave chase, they fired. They claimed to have sunk two boats. They did not. The Pentagon Papers showed that nothing happened, that there were no Vietnamese boats in the Gulf. At the time, the captain of the USS Maddox had sent a cable to the Joint Chiefs saying he wasn't sure, that there had been engagement, and he really thought that, some time should be taken to investigate. But that time was not taken. On August 7th, 1964, armed with this false information, Congress approves the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, approves all necessary measures to assist the Southeast Asian countries under the threat of communist aggression. This was not notably a declaration of war, but it was nonetheless effective. The Tonkin Gulf Resolution justified Johnson's and Nixon's actions in the war, and bumped Johnson's approval rating by a full 30 points overnight. It gave Johnson carte blanche to send troops and send them, slowly at first, and then not so much. Tonkin Gulf was a headline that got America a war. We had the war, sort of, but we needed a reason. Remember the Maine? Yeah, they didn't start it this time, but Time, Life, they headlined it. Everybody headlined it. North Vietnamese boats attacked American ships. This was war. Except, of course, they didn't attack. So combat troops go in, still fighting an insurgent guerrilla force that was itself battling against a long-standing occupation, still not winning that fight, and increasingly on the part of the troops not wanting to wage it. By 1968, morale had pretty much collapsed. There was dissent among the troops and protests at home. A real aversion to having and sending U.S. troops abroad started to manifest itself. A total, absolute cultural rejection of the draft became widespread. Reagan would later dub this the Vietnam Syndrome. On the battle and the home fronts, increasingly, Americans did not want to fight this war. The communism argument was just losing force. But not before 58,220 American soldiers lost their lives, not before the Vietnamese death count reached at least 1 million and probably much closer to 4 million. Not before more explosives were dropped into Vietnam than had been dropped in the entirety of World War II by all parties. January 27, 1973 saw the Paris Peace Accords, and with this, the withdrawal of American troops. It also ended the draft in America this time, and that began the all-volunteer force that continues to define American armed forces to this day. We'll come back to that. It was Nixon who got us out of Vietnam and then went down in flames pretty precipitously after in the Watergate scandal. We won't follow his story too particularly here, except to note that he had the good sense to know when he had lost the nation's confidence, and he had the humility or courage or whatever it was to resign at that point. And also to note, just in passing, that the highest marginal tax rate under Nixon was higher than the highest marginal tax rate under Obama. All to say, a great deal of our political understanding is relative to our historical moment. So, Saigon falls. 1973's Paris Peace Accords had ceased fighting, but in fact, not everyone stopped. And, and the fighting continued until 1975, April 30th, when Saigon fell and the very last American troops leave by helicopter, along with any American collaborators or supporters or allies who could find a seat on a helicopter or a boat. Whatever morale was left among the troops at the beginning of April 1975 pretty much fell with Saigon. America lost at this point an extraordinarily unpopular war, and Vietnam veterans came home not to the parades, the honor, the respect, and the fanfare of previous wars. They came home to disrespect, to dishonor, to abuse, most already having been demoralized by the war itself. Vietnam veterans were spit on. They were called baby killers. When they returned, they had hard times getting jobs. They, in extraordinarily high percentages, found themselves homeless and battling drugs and depression and PTSD. This was not the support the troops America, home front that America has come to know and has grown accustomed to in recent years. It was a home front that had really lost a great deal of trust in its government, in its military, in its purpose. There was, in the 60s and in the 70s, a lot of dissent, counterculture, anti-war protests, new religious movements, feminism. What we'll focus on here is the civil rights movement, also happening at this time. In 1963, the year before the Tonkin Gulf Resolution embroiled the U.S. deeply within combat in Vietnam, Birmingham, Alabama, was the most segregated city in the country. George Wallace was the governor, and Bull Connor was the commissioner of public safety. Both were white supremacists with ties to the KKK, openly ultra-segregationist. In January 1963, at his first gubernatorial inauguration speech, Wallace assured his crowd rousingly, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. He was a four-time governor, also a four-time presidential candidate. He ran on an anti-black, anti-student, anti-Vietnam War protest platform. He ran on a platform of hate and anger and fear. He was a figurehead for the resistance to the civil rights movement. When the looting starts, the shooting starts, is a phrase that Wallace popularized during his 1968 presidential campaign. It had been used the year before by the segregationist Miami police chief. But it was back in January of 63 when he assured Alabama that racial segregation was something that he was committed to. Then, in May of 1963, Birmingham desegregated lunch counters, restrooms, fitting rooms, drinking fountains, in answer to the 1954 Supreme Court decision in Brown versus the Board of Education, but really in more direct response to the Birmingham campaign, which had happened, immediately previously, not a decade previously. The Birmingham campaign was a nonviolent protest movement organized by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and covered by media outlets across the country. Martin Luther King was arrested and jailed during this time as part of this on April 12th, which was Good Friday. And it's from the Birmingham jail that he writes what became famous as the Letter from the Birmingham Jail, which you should read. So in May, they desegregated, and the bombs started going off at houses and businesses. June 11th, 1963, George Wallace made what they called a stand in the schoolhouse door, to block two black students, Vivian Malone and James Hood, from entering. Wallace had the Alabama National Guard helping, so Kennedy, president at the time, federalized the National Guard, and the students were allowed to enter, and George Wallace became famous. The next day, June 12th, 1963, Medgar Evers, a field director of the NAACP in Mississippi, was assassinated in his driveway. It took his widow years to get indictments for that, even though there was a great deal of evidence at the time. August 28th, 1963, saw the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, at which Martin Luther King delivered his I Have a Dream speech. Then, September 9th, 1963, back in Birmingham, the JFK once more federalized Alabama National Guard members to desegregate the public schools. And a week later, on September 15th, 1963, at the 16th Street Baptist Church, which was big, central to the black community, a site of civil rights organizing, and also a church holding Sunday services, getting ready to hold Sunday services, a bomb that was placed under the stairs went off, killing 4 young girls and blinding a 5th. Martin Luther King at that point addressed George Wallace, saying, "The blood of our little children is on your hands." Federal investigation turns up 4 suspects. There were no indictments until 1977, 2001, and 2002. All received life sentences. The 4th suspect died before the government got around to indicting him. Definitely a case of justice deferred. Excuse me. Protests continue, and Commissioner of Public Safety Bull Connor continues to respond with fire hoses and police dogs used on men, women, and children. Then, on November 22nd, 1963, President John F. Kennedy is assassinated. Lyndon Johnson, then the vice president, becomes the president, and in 1964, Johnson pushed through Kennedy's Civil Rights Act. 1965, Congress passes the Voting Rights Act, which grants all Americans unburdened, unlimited access to the vote in law, not in many cases still by practice. Now, George Wallace continues in politics, running for president, cycling in and out as governor. While at a campaign stop on his 1972 bid for the presidency, he's shot 3 times, and a bullet that is lodged in his spine paralyzes him from the waist down for the rest of his life, which was, he believed, why he never got the presidential nomination. But he did keep running. And in 1982, he ran for governor again and won. Before the race, he repented, admitting that he had been wrong all along about race, said that he never meant anything by segregation, never meant anything against anybody. He just thought that segregation would be best for everybody concerned. He won, and he won with 90% of the black vote. He's worth this moment that we're spending on him because his populist, angry, anti-DC brand of politics set the stage for Nixon, for Reagan, for Trump, and for Clinton. It's a brand of politics that has power. He was early to this brand of politics, and he was also very effective. The coarse, unvarnished populist who sees and plays on an us versus them mentality, the politician who's against politics. And at a time when the nation was losing trust in a government that was seen as corrupt, was becoming cynical about even the possibility of changing this system that had proven itself in so many ways resistant to change and maybe incapable of it. 1963 had seen racist violence, it had seen bombings, lynchings, protests, the assassination of a president. Before it was over, 1964 would see the Civil Rights Act passed and signed into law. George Wallace's unsuccessful bid for the presidency, his every effort to get the Civil Rights Act repealed. It would see the American fabrication of the Tonkin Gulf episode and a full-blown commitment to combat in Vietnam. But before much of the events of 1964 had come to pass, Malcolm X gives one of American history's greatest speeches. The Ballot or the Bullet is a speech given twice, once on April 3rd, 1964 in Cleveland, and again on April 12th, 1964 in Detroit. The day after the Detroit speech, Malcolm X leaves on the trip that will include his participation in the Hajj, the pilgrimage to the holy city of Mecca, to the foundational sites of Islam, a pilgrimage required of every adult Muslim who is physically and financially able once in their lifetime. And on that pilgrimage, he would experience racial integration and equality like he had never known in America. On the Hajj, all Muslims are equal in the faith and in the practice. All signs of wealth or status are stripped away. All pilgrims wear the same simple clothing. Now, he'd not yet been on the Hajj at the point of this speech, but before he had, the month before, in March 1964, he had separated from the Nation of Islam, particularly American innovation in the world of Muslim faith. The NOI had been and continued to be a powerful force for Black Americans, and it was also a very contentious force. During this era of protests and civil rights agitation and white supremacist politicians stoking fear in their mostly poor white constituencies, the Nation of Islam stood as one more, sometimes aggressive, challenge to the white American status quo. It argued for full separatism, for not voting, for not participating in the political process of white America, for not working with the civil rights activists who were seen as accommodationist. Malcolm X, for most of his public life, stood with this position that the nonviolent and integrationist methods of the mainstream civil rights movement were ineffective at best and more likely counterproductive, leading to an increase in disempowerment, disenfranchisement, and violence. Now, historian Peniel Joseph describes the Nation of Islam by saying that it combined Islam with a doctrine of Black self-determination and self-sufficiency and personal responsibility, and it did that. It also supported and encouraged total racial separation, and its theology is anti-Semitic, anti-white, anti-LGBT. The Southern Poverty Law Center has designated it and follows it as a hate group. Malcolm X was introduced to this group while in prison, and just a little bit on his background and how he got there. He was born in 1925. His father was a Black nationalist Baptist preacher. The KKK burned down their house when Malcolm was a kid, and his dad stood up for himself, shot back at the fleeing arsons, and was murdered in 1931. His mother had mental health challenges, and she had 8 kids during the Depression. She ended up in an institution, and the kids ended up in foster care. Malcolm drops out of school, goes to New York City, gets involved in crime, goes to prison. It's there that he's introduced to the Nation of Islam and takes the name Malcolm X. Then he gets out of prison, dedicates himself to the cause. Separating from the Nation of Islam in March of 1964 was a big step for Malcolm X, who had worked himself to a position of power and respect in that organization. Now, he was still committed to Black nationalism, militant as needed, committed to the Black community's right to and need for self-determination and self-defense. This speech that we've read really, it's the most complete articulation of his own brand of Black nationalism. He calls for a unity of Black political and economic action. He's not anti-anything, he tells his audience. And this is a break from the NOI. He says to his audience, we're all in the same boat, despite their many differences, which he acknowledges. Most of them, for instance, are Christian. He says we're all going to catch the same hell from the same man. And he tells them we're not anti-white, but we are anti-exploitation, anti-degradation, anti-oppression. So he makes it intentionally clear that it's not about innate characteristics here, it's about behavior, but it's not just about personal behavior, it's beyond that. It's about generational, structural behavior. Why keep saying the white man then? He says because, he tells his audience, it's the white man who keeps doing it. The government has proven itself unwilling or unable to protect the life and the property of Black Americans, so Black Americans have to protect themselves. And if you fight here, he says, as opposed to Vietnam, you will at least know what you're fighting for. He connects the battle in the home fronts, saying, the same government that you go abroad to fight and die for is the government that is in a conspiracy to deprive you of your voting rights, deprive you of your economic opportunities, deprive you of decent housing, deprive you of decent education. For the Black community in 1964, that was just abundantly true. And these rights and protections are left unmet while, quote, he spends all those billions for his defense budget. He questions the government's sincerity, calls out the hypocrisy and the moral bankruptcy of America. Uncle Sam has no conscience, he says. If the ostensibly ultimate values that our troops risk their lives to defend and uphold are not defended and upheld for those living in our nation and fighting in its army, then war is a sham. Then war is a racket. Then Smedley Butler was right. If you want to defend ultimate values abroad, you have to manifest them at home. And home isn't something that Malcolm X can comfortably call America. He tells us he is a victim of Americanism, of the democracy that is really a disguised hypocrisy. He doesn't see the American dream, he tells us. He sees an American nightmare. But he hasn't given up. Remember, during this era of extreme social fragmentation and racism and violence, he has just left behind the staunchly separationist Nation of Islam. He has not given up, and you don't need new legislation, he says. America already contains the resources required for its own redemption. They're already there. The tools for justice themselves, fired in a crucible of inhumanity, of the most wretched expressions of the basest will to power and greed, these tools, they're already there. But that doesn't mean society doesn't need a revolution. This speech is a call to revolution. The ballot or the bullet, liberty or death, by whatever means necessary. The speech leans on the nation's revolutionary founding, as well as the legislative possibilities for revolution to be bloodless in the United States. But immediate and significant change remains the call. If it's not a country of freedom, he says, change it. And why? Why is the fight worth it? Because, he says, if you don't take this kind of stand, your little children will grow up and look at you and think, shame. There's a generational duty to work for and to require justice. There's a sense of futurity here, again. Remember back to Thomas Paine, if there be troubles, there must be troubles, let them be in our time, that our children may know peace. Malcolm X returns from the Hajj with a far more inclusive vision than he had before he left. Then, in February of 1965, his house is firebombed. A week later, on February 21st, 1965, he's shot and killed at 39 years old. 3 Nation of Islam members were convicted and imprisoned. During his life, Malcolm X was a polarizing figure, absolutely polarizing. Since his death, his image has transformed. In 1999, the feds put him on a postage stamp. In June 2018, Mariah Parker was sworn into public office as a county commissioner in Athens, Georgia, on a copy of Malcolm X's autobiography rather than the Bible. And following Malcolm X, her politics aim at more transformation than at progress. Because if the system itself is unjust, she argues, then progress is just more of the same. And as Eisenhower warned us, progress is not a value. And progress is not something we'll ever authentically make if we don't consider our values, if we don't know what they are and how they manifest in our shared civic life. In the last years of his life, as you read, Martin Luther King turned his attention to the interrelated flaws of racism, poverty, militarism, and materialism. And he called for a radical revolution of values, a radical reconstruction of society itself, away from conquest, away from the complacency of industrial affluence that rested on and required the continued subjugation of black and brown people, of women, of the economically powerless, and that rested on and required a thoroughgoing militarization and the consumerism that is its natal twin. Between 1965 and 1968, America saw hundreds of riots. President Johnson's Kerner Commission was tasked with understanding the causes, and they wrote a report. It was published in 1968. It said, White racism is essentially responsible for the explosive mixture which has been accumulating in our cities since the end of World War II. It said, rather than rejecting the American system, rioters were anxious to obtain a place for themselves within it. Poverty and racism and an increasingly militarized police force were cited as causes for these riots. President Johnson, he didn't like it. He didn't like what he read, and he disregarded. He sort of buried the report. That same year, 1968, Martin Luther King was shot and killed, and then Nixon was elected, promising to restore law and order. Now, it was Reagan who made Martin Luther King's birthday a holiday, and just one more point in terms of the relativity of values and political understanding. In 2011, Martin Luther King had a 94% approval rating in the American public. Not surprising. 94% of the American populace says they approve of Martin Luther King and the work he did. In 1966, 2 years before he was shot and killed, that approval rating was at 33%. One of the people making up that 33% was Bobby Kennedy, whose speech, it was scheduled to be a campaign speech, he was running for president, broke the news of King's death to an Indianapolis crowd. Now, hundreds of cities rioted that night, violent, destructive. There were no riots in Indianapolis. He asks the crowd, what kind of people do we want to be? What kind of nation do we want to be? He expresses needs in terms of values, in terms of a mythos. He calls for a kind of self-reflection about the motives that drive the actions that that we engage in, swept up in one or another cause, but without reference to a set of principles, a moral horizon according to which we, orient ourselves. He quotes Aeschylus, and he does from the Oresteia, which is a trilogy about the establishment of justice, about the difference and the tension between revenge and justice. It's a tragedy. A very slightly longer version of that quote is this: "He who learns must suffer. In our sleep, pain which we cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart until, in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God. He who learns must suffer." Bobby Kennedy was shot and killed 2 months later at a campaign stop in Los Angeles. His body was carried on a train from New York, where his funeral services were held, to D.C., to be buried, to be interned, to be laid in state, and the train tracks were absolutely crowded, lined with people on the way. He was a figure who drew a great deal of, public attention and interest. The Cold War era was a time of fear of communists, fear of integration, fear of change, and it was also a time of overcoming that fear. The Kerner Report said that rioters didn't reject the American system, they wanted a place within it. The American system, that first world system of liberally democratic industrial capitalism, it's comfortable, it's rich, it's summertime, the living's easy, if you have some financial power. A riot is the language of the unheard, King told us in 1966, but complacency is the most common language of those who conflate democracy with capitalism, of those who conflate freedom with consumption, and who are fortunate enough to find a toehold, however small toehold, in that consumer arena. Democracy is not the same as capitalism. Freedom is not tantamount to consumption. And as long as we continue to approach these as equivalent, as long as our mythos remains muddled in this way, then we will have complacency and we will have riots. And I see no prospect for justice there. Next, we will turn to CENTCOM's ascendancy and the global war on terror.